Thanks for that introduction, Tom. Right, so yeah, the new position does start in September, I can confirm that, and the job title is actually pretty exciting as well. It's Transport and Big Data. Whatever big data is, I could spend the rest of this talk defining what big data is or isn't. You'll be very pleased to hear that I'm not going to spend any time doing that, and I'm just going to get on with it. But a theme that I'll come back to again and again in this talk is the importance of evidence for making transport decisions. So I think everyone could agree that we want evidence-based policies. That's critical for deciding what we do, where we build, and what kind of interventions are going to be successful. So I'm actually going to start out by talking about some of the evidence about why cycling in the first place. I think at a cycling conference you can expect that most people think that cycling is a good thing to do, that we want more cycling, but I think often it's good to reflect on why we want cycling in the first place. It's just another mode of transport, but it certainly seems to be something that people get quite interested about. So I'm going to touch on that. And then the next stage is to say, well, why is it marginalised in large parts of the world? Why is it not the main means of transport for short urban trips where, as Rune has pointed out, it's actually possible to do even in deepest, darkest, coldest Oslo, of all places, where they've had a 40% increase in the percentage increase in the number of trips taking place in winter, which is an amazing statistic. So it's actually about not just cycling, it's about trying to make cycling more central to the transport planning process. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. And then finally, as Tom alluded to, I've spent a lot of my time actually developing software and writing code that enables, that's basically creating a tool to help with this engagement process and thinking about the future and creating scenarios at quite high geographical resolution, so you can actually visualize what a high cycling future could look like. And it's actually been really fun for me to step away from the kind of coal face of developing this thing called the propensity to cycle tool and actually put it in context. So this is definitely a wide boundary, big picture talk, but I will go into some details. And it's great to kind of come to a place where there's so many practitioners, because I'm not a practitioner, I'm an academic, and my job is to try and find out the best available evidence that can hopefully be useful in the policy process. But I don't know a huge amount about the politics, even though politics is central to it. So I'm going to touch on that in the best way I can, but primarily talking about the evidence. So, hoping this thing works. Could you skip? Oh, it is skipping. Aha, there we go. Sorry, I'm getting disorientated by this. Yeah, there we go. That's what I'm going to talk about. So, because I was looking at the slide on my computer. Cycling in context. Right. So, going back to the kind of global picture, obviously London is a global city, and I think it's useful to frame the debate around transport planning and cycling in the global context, especially now because more and more countries are having increased numbers of cars. Kind of traditionally developing countries have seen huge increases in the proportion of trips that are made by cars. So over time, I think it's fair to say that the types of problems that we face in traditional Western cities are the same as those, increasingly the same, being faced in all countries around the world. And one representation of this is quite a kind of macabre representation, is road traffic casualties. So this is actually a huge problem, and especially in the developing world. So I think that's a good place to kind of start our thinking about why is a cycling revolution a good thing. So the graphic up there shows the number of road deaths per 100,000 population, and you can see that large parts of the world just have this massively high rate. So the way to deal with that is where you can put in all these regulations, or, as Rune is alluding to, perhaps look for alternatives to the car if they're causing this externality. And in terms of negative externalities, this is only the tip of the iceberg. So this is the most obvious negative impact from the car-dominated system, that they cause high levels of road traffic casualties. And to put numbers on that, in terms of the reason for death, it's somewhere in the 20s to 30s is the most common cause of death. But if you think about the people who are getting hit, it's people who aren't usually at the end of their life, or in many cases children, unfortunately. So there's another measure that is an alternative to death, which is disability life years lost. So when you measure how bad it is in terms of disability adjusted life years lost, road traffic casualties is actually the 8th worst in the world, and that's projected to grow to third worst cause of disability adjusted life years lost worldwide by 2030. That is a really serious problem, and I think that's something that everyone can relate to. And I haven't even mentioned the wider issues of pollution, which is associated with respiratory disease. I haven't even mentioned the obesity crisis, which is obviously going on. I haven't even mentioned climate change. And climate change actually has the potential to totally change the borders of these countries. If you look at the latest science on sea level rise, there are projections that go far beyond 1 metre. There are projections that go above 10 metres over the next 500 to 1,000 years. So we're dealing with some really serious issues here. And I think it's good to remember that what we're doing by focusing on cycling is a positive solution, and it's also exciting that we're involved in a transport mode that has the potential to help resolve some of these really big issues. And when you see things happening, like a 40% increase in cycle use in the winter in Norway, you start to think that we can actually solve these problems. So that's great. In terms of going back to the climate change issue, it's clear that the main reason for climate change is anthropogenic CO2 emissions from the science, and it's also clear that CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases are driven by energy use. So if we can understand where energy use comes from, then we can start to tackle the problem. Understand the problem before trying to solve it is the general way that we deal with issues. So this graphic just shows that the proportion of the world's oil supply consumed by transport is increasing over time. Back in 1973, it only consumed about half. And now, fast forward to 2013, it's probably increased more. It's almost 2/3 of global oil supply. So these are the really big, challenging issues that the humble bicycle can help to deal with. And I think that's an amazing thing. Such a small, human-sized technology can link to these really ingrained problems. So just checking it's gone up. No, it hasn't. Okay, so going back to the evidence. Okay, where's that energy going in transport? Well, if you do a breakdown of it, the bicycle wouldn't even figure in there. Obviously, cyclists eat food, and it takes some energy to produce a bicycle. But a bicycle, or other forms of cycles, like quadricycles, are around about 100 times lighter than a car. So they're far more energy efficient, essentially. And you can see that in terms of that transport energy, around about half of it is being used by cars or other small vehicles. So essentially, all of the signals in the last few slides are pointing towards the problem with a car-dominated transport system. There we go. So the other point to make with this slide is that yes, it's only around about 1/3 and to be specific, about 27% of global energy supply is consumed by transport. But that 27% is actually some of the hardest to decarbonise that there is. So electricity is relatively easy to decarbonise because renewables can, solar panels can easily convert sunlight into electricity. But if you try and make an aeroplane zero carbon, it's actually really challenging. And the same applies for cars. And I liked Rune's points about a car is a car. What wasn't mentioned there is that even when you have electric cars, they're still highly dependent on fossil fuels because of the manufacture of these things requires huge amounts of energy going into the batteries. Lithium is an expensive chemical to mine and highly energy intensive. And in a country like the UK, where we haven't yet decarbonised our transport system, our electricity system, you're actually talking about coal-fired cars when you've got electric cars in an energy mix that's got coal in it. So that's a point that I'd like to make on that slide as well. So, what hope do we have to change this? These are really massive questions. So how can we possibly confront these in a relatively small cycling conference? Well, the next slide suggests that it might be all doom and gloom. This is about 10 years worth of data, and this is showing the modal split that people in the UK travel by according to a survey. It was the British Household Panel Survey, and it just shows people take a long time to change. So what's the point in even trying? But this is where it comes down to the representation of data and how many data sources you have. If you only have this data source and you assume that that's going to continue, you would just say, well, we're never going to change, what's the point? But the next slide shows that, in fact, we do change. And if you just extend the x-axis by a little bit, you can see that there's been a revolution in how we've changed, how we travel around over the last 100 years. And I think it would be foolish to assume that we're going to continue in that seeming equilibrium that most of us have experienced throughout the rest of our lifetimes. So the graphic, just to clarify, shows the amount of energy used per trip, and this is per trip to work because this is something we have good data on, divided up by different modes of travel. And you can see that the car has completely exploded over the past 100 years, and now it's plateaued. And the reason why I've extended out the x-axis to the 100-year mark is to emphasise this uncertainty. And it would be a mistake, I think, to take the previous slide and just say, oh, well, obviously we're going to just keep doing that. We don't know that. So the future is uncertain, and data can help understand that and the visualisation of data. And another trend that we picked up on that not many, that not many people are talking about within transport planning and transport policy is the fact that we are changing. Over the last decade or so, year on year, there have been decreases in the number of trips taken per person per year. We can hypothesize about why that might be. The truth is, we don't know. I think it could be linked to the digital revolution. So we can substitute travel within our local communities by going online and doing stuff. So this trend, again, it looks quite dramatic. We can shift the y-axis this time. And again, the visualization of data really can change the message that you're telling with it. But this one, even when you do that, you can see, hopefully, that this is showing a decline in the number of trips made per year. Why is that important? This is important because within the transport planning discipline, people are always concerned about capacity and gridlock and how can we get over this. If this is really happening and we extrapolate into the future, that would have massive implications for the widths and number of new roads that we need to build, potentially freeing up extra capacity for more sustainable modes. So I think that's an important point, and it's just going back to the kind of age-old assumption that car growth is inevitable and will always continue. And the graph on the slide actually comes out of a report written by myself and Fiona Crawford, who's also at Leeds University, that actually tried to quantify the economic benefits of cycling up to 2050 in the UK. And what we found was uncertainty surrounding this trip rate led to huge differences in the numbers. And this uncertainty often isn't taken into account by transport planners. We're too arrogant, we're too optimistic about our numbers always being right. And this just shows that there's many ways to extrapolate that graph into the future. But there has been some research done. So any model or any method is imperfect. This was a report done by the Cabinet Office in 2009 that tried to quantify the externalities of the transport system. And trying to link this back to the bike, I've given quite a lot of big picture, which I think is really important, but it's also important to link this back to cycling. So according to this report, delays, accidents, poor air quality, physical inactivity, and greenhouse gas emissions all add up to a huge externality that is paid for by society as a whole. What's interesting about this graphic is that cycling can actually help tackle every single one of these multi-million issues, multi-billion pound issues. So excess delays, obviously you're more reliable and you're likely to get to work or wherever you're going on time. If you're travelling on a two-wheeled mode or three-wheel mode, accidents, yeah, it can definitely deal with the accident issue because cycles tend to go a lot slower and have a lot lower energy density than cars. Poor air quality definitely can help with that one. Physical activity, now that's one thing that electric cars can't deliver on, and neither can, and to a lesser extent, electric bikes, but they still can do that if they've got pedal electric, and noise and amenity. So cycling can actually tackle every single one of these multi-billion issues, billion-pound issues, which I think is really exciting. So unfortunately, cycling has been marginalised, and being in London and going around central London, it's really exciting and it feels like we're in the midst of a revolution. But I deliberately took this photo from a part of London that hasn't seen a very high increase in cycling so far, which is Croydon. So while we have great infrastructure on Blackfriars Bridge and other parts of London, still I think it's fair to say that once you go maybe beyond 2 to 3 kilometres outside the centre of London, this is actually much more normal. So we've still got a hell of a long way to go. And why is it being marginalised? Well, that's what this talk's really trying to address. How can we embed cycling deeper into the transport planning process? So the next question as well for me is, well, if cycling is good at tackling these issues, does all kinds of cycling tackle them in the same way? Or in other words, if our true motivations for increasing cycling are environmental, are health related, to what extent is increasing cycling actually meeting those policy objectives? So I've just got one example of it. It's just to kind of make the point really. And this is to show the estimated impacts of different bike share schemes in different cities. So you've got a number of cities, including a couple from Australia, a couple from the USA, and then London. And what this table is showing is, first, how many bike trips are made per day. So obviously, if you build infrastructure or you provide cycling facilities, it's important that they're well used. And then you've got this number called a replacement ratio. Now, in the original paper, they don't use the term replacement ratio. They use a different term, which is car replacement. But basically, it's the same thing. I've put it in this measure because I think it's easier to understand. What this means is, how many additional bicycle trips do you need to replace a single car trip? So if I've made the argument that the evidence suggests that the externalities associated with the transport system are primarily due to car use, that suggests the logical next step is that the positive impact of increased cycling depends on its ability to reduce car dependency. And this table shows that in different interventions, there's been a different rate of replacement of cars. This isn't kind of trying to make a value judgment, it's just data that I took out of a paper. But I think it's really interesting to note that a city such as Brisbane has a very low replacement ratio or a very high potential for bikes to replace car trips. So you only need 5 extra car trips, according to this paper, to replace a single car trip. In London, it's not necessarily because it was badly implemented, it's just simply because the modal share of people who use this is already not very high. There's already not a very high level of car use. So in fact, you need, according to this paper, 50 additional hire bikes in London to replace a single car trip. That's the wider point. I'm not trying to delve into the details of bike share. So moving on, and I'm trying to juggle 2 sets of slides. And I've actually got the equation there. You'll be pleased to know this is the only formula that I've got in my slides, but delta is a symbol that usually means change. So the change in the number of trips cycled divided by the negative of the number of trips driven is this concept I came up with back in 2011 called replacement ratio. And I think that's a really useful metric to understand what the potential impacts of new cycle policies are going to be. So to take one example, if you have a soft intervention that specifically targets car-dependent adults to cycle, your replacement ratio is going to be lower, meaning that you'll need fewer bikes to replace a single car trip. If you have a policy that just encourages people to drive to leisure routes, that could actually lead to a negative replacement ratio, which is what is being shown here in the Tour de France, where loads of people go out on a big bike trip, but probably the number of cars is roughly equal to the number of bikes. So you're not really reducing car dependency and tackling what I would argue is at the root cause of some of the transport issues we've been seeing. So what is this thing called transport planning? In the title it's called transport policy. In this slide it's called transport planning. I don't really distinguish between them. To me it's the system within which this evidence is interpreted and eventually turned into action. So I've got a slide here showing a really early representation of some of the very early transport models that fitted into this transport planning process. And this is from San Francisco. So the point here is the origins of transport planning and transport modelling go back to a very specific social context, which was the explosion in car use and suburbia in the USA. There's a recent book being published called Forecasting Urban Travel by a guy called David Boyce and Hugh Williams, which gives a fantastic historical account of this history. And what it shows is that the whole discipline is based around this specific context. The problem is that the context has changed, but we're still using the same tools and the same thinking to solve problems that have moved on. Back in the 1950s, climate change and the obesity epidemic weren't even on the radar, yet we're still using the same institutions. So the next few slides are going to talk about transport planning and how the policy structures in which it operates and some of the tools that we use for transport planning are kind of based around this model of how to accommodate more cars, which back then was a valid question from their perspective. So this is just a screenshot from the Department for Transport's website, and it shows where priorities lie. And it's not necessarily on the kind of modes that tackle the really serious problems that we're facing. Next up is you think, well, why is that happening? And that involves going into the institution itself and finding out how the institution is operating. So let's do that. Let's take a look at how the Department for Transport is organised. So you've got a board of directors, and each person on there has a kind of specific remit. And you can see, hopefully, that you can't really see the text, but if you follow the link, which is on there, the slides will be made available after, you'll see there's definitely no mention of walking and cycling on the main board. And they split up into different groups, kind of directed by the politicians in there. And so this is the kind of political side of it. And then these guys answer to the politicians. My point is that the structure of this institution, which is the Department for Transport, but I'm not meaning to pick out the Department for Transport, it applies to transport planning organisations across the board, is that the actual structure of the institution is not designed to deal with the problems that we're facing in transport systems at the moment. And this board is only a small subset of the the Department for Transport. So the person who has oversight for walking and cycling is the roads and local group. So one of those people, it's John Dow. He has under him a number of people who look at different options. And within this roads, traffic and local group, there's one person allocated to local. So again, we're still not seeing the words walking and cycling. So you have to go quite far along the institutional chain before these sustainable modes, which are also healthy modes, are actually mentioned. So the next slide is to go down to this person's remit. He also has a number of people under him who are too small to have their photos shown, but they exist. And you have to go all the way down, all the people that are under him, until you see walking, cycling and walking. But still, it's not called walking and cycling, it's called sustainable accessible travel, and that's Pauline Reed. So that shows that the institutional structure of a particular transport planning organisation is not really designed to lead to a walking and cycling revolution that the best available evidence suggests that we need. Let's put all of that in perspective now. So you've got you've got a big powerful board, then that goes down to another group, then you've got another person within that, and sat right down here is where you have your walking and cycling. So you can see from the structure of the institution that it's not being prioritised. As I said, that's as political as I'm going to get. I'm not a politician. My job is to provide evidence to the debate. So the next thing is, what tools do we use to do our transport planning? And there's also, as a kind of techie, geeky kind of a person, I'm interested in this side of it, and to some extent find it more fun. So my point in the next few slides is that the tools that we're using for transport planning, in the age of big data and the data revolution, we need to use tech. We need to use computers to do the work because there's too much information for the human brain to process. As one of the earlier slides of San Francisco, someone probably very carefully drew that out by hand. We can't do that anymore because there's too much data. So we need to use computers. The first problem is that we're using black boxes. So often people don't understand all of the complexities of the tool that they're using to make decisions, especially when you have secondments, people who did the work initially move on to something else, but they keep using the same tool. That's a problem. And that's just illustrated in this slightly amusing cartoon of a machine that is fed data and then it produces stuff at the end of the day, and then they have to use it. The next slide shows another problem, is that I believe that many tools for transport planning are actually quite blunt. So if your only tool is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. And the analogy there is that most transport planning tools were designed around the car. So they're not particularly well adapted to take into account walking and cycling. And that's where my work comes in, really. Another issue is sometimes, actually, this links back to Rune's talk of the simple presentation of simple information. We don't need to over-complexify things. Yet I think it's fair to say that some models for transport planning look a little bit like this, which is actually a cigarette packaging machine, so really healthy machine there, and it's extremely complex. So that's another issue that we've got with the tools. The tools for the trade were not really developed to solve the problems that we're facing. So there we go. They're too complex, and we need to deal with that. So moving on.